now I'm going to, it's my pleasure to introduce our last speaker, and my delight as well, to introduce Dr. Harry Shier. Harry is Associate at the Centre for Education in Health and Environment in Nicaragua, and a researcher in the Covision project at the University College Dublin. And Harry is known to many of us from his readings and writings and publications and presentations, his rich contribution to child participation across many years, and his passion for participation rights for children. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Harry. And thank you so much, Harry, for joining us today from Dublin.
Thank you very much, Marianne. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me share my screen and get started. That's the one I want. Just go to full screen mode. Right, can you give me a thumbs up if you're seeing that properly? Yep, good. Okay, so I'm going to look at the aspect of supporting children as researchers when the children are doing the research and the adult is facilitating and supporting them in that process. And rather than focus on one project, I'm actually going to take you on a tour through my life story in chapters to look at a number of projects and how things have developed. So basically 4 chapters. I'm going to start with where this all began for me, which was in the United Kingdom. I am Irish, born and bred in Ireland, but I moved to the United Kingdom as a young man and lived there for many years. So it started for me in the United Kingdom. But then I moved to Nicaragua and took ideas that had started in the UK to the Nicaraguan context, and then becoming embedded in Nicaragua, developing the transformative research approach, and finally my doctoral studies, which led to an analytical tool. So we can see if we can get through all of that in 20 minutes. I do believe that we can. So the first chapter, UK 1993 to 2000, the Article 31 Children's Consultancy Scheme. And in fact, this all actually started in Australia, because I started my career back in the 1970s working on adventure playgrounds in the United Kingdom. But then I had the opportunity to go to the World Play Summit in Melbourne in 1993, and that's where I discovered children's rights. And this changed the course of my life, because that day in Melbourne, I realized that whatever issue you're concerned about, children's rights provides an underpinning framework, but it also provides an overarching approach to the work which I've been committed to ever since. So I came back to the United Kingdom, determined that everybody was going to know about Article 31 and that children have a right to play. And so first thing I did was formed a committee, and we organized the first ever Article 31 conference. This was in Birmingham, England in June 1994. And then that led to the publication of the Article 31 Action Pack in 1995, which is still available. If it's a historical document now, but it has a unique, otherwise unavailable paper by Roger Hart in it. So it's definitely still worth looking up. And then from then we launched the Article 31 Action Network. And then in 1997, as a practical demonstration of what we believed in, we created the Article 31 Children's Consultancy Scheme. Because at that time, there was a fashion for making programs and institutions child-friendly. And this was very strong in the arts, culture, and recreation sectors. And people were looking for expert advice, and they were approaching people like me. But we were saying, children are experts on what is child-friendly and what isn't, what works for children and what doesn't, what's fun and what's boring, what makes them feel included and what makes them feel excluded. So we developed a methodology which we called children's consultancy, where children would become the expert advisors to people who wanted to make things child-friendly. Just a few examples of some of the projects that child consultants worked on in the late 90s. Here you can see a team of child consultants advising the management at building the new Manchester City Art Gallery on how to create a child-friendly gallery. Here we can see child consultants commissioned by the British Waterways Board to research the educational and recreational potential of the English Canal Network. And here, child consultants advising the management at the Tower of London, the famous historical monument in the centre of London, which you've probably seen pictures of or even visited, how to make it less boring. And after several years of that work, my own thinking, my own reflection on that work led to this new analysis, the Pathways to Participation model. Now, I could give you a whole lecture on this. It is very well known around the world these days, but I think we'll leave that for another time. I suggest if you're not aware of it, maybe go and look it up. But yeah, it talks about that there are 5 levels of participation, from the starting point where children are listened to, up to the top level here where children share power and responsibility for decision making. But that in itself was nothing new. What was particularly different, and I think made it so, gave it such impact, was the idea that a lot depends on the commitment of the adults who are engaging with and supporting these processes. An opening occurs when you're ready and willing to work with children at a certain level, but the opportunity is there when you're able, when the conditions are in place to make that possible. And most importantly, the obligation occurs when it's policy that this is the way we work. So like I say, we could talk about this for a whole lecture, but I think we'll move on to chapter 2. So basically, when the millennium came, I realized that I hadn't found my true home in the United Kingdom, and rather than return to Ireland, I moved to Nicaragua in Central America. And I arrived there just 3 weeks after the Pathways model was published in the United Kingdom. The big children's rights issue there, where I was living, was child labor on the coffee plantations, and linked to that, the children struggle to realize their right to education. I worked for SESESMA, the Center for Education in Health and Environment, where I am a lifelong associate now, a local voluntary organization based in San Ramon in Nicaragua. So in 2007, we were asked to get involved in planning a national conference on violence against children. And the organizers needed an expert to do a keynote speech. So we were thinking, who would we ask? Maybe get somebody from UNICEF, one of the top people from Save the Children. And thinking of my previous experience in the United Kingdom, I said, well, why shouldn't the children do the keynote speech? They're the real experts in the topic of violence against children. And so a team of child coffee workers, this team here in the picture, from Santa Marta Coffee Plantation, became the first child consultants in Nicaragua. So preparing the project, carrying out field research, peer-to-peer interviewing, drawing up their recommendations, analyzing the data, preparing their final report, rehearsing how they were going to present the report. And then came the big day of the journey to the capital city, Managua, to present the report at the conference. I had actually hired a minibus to take us all to the capital city. It would be about 3.5 hours drive, but we found the minibus couldn't get up the rocky road to the plantation where the children lived. So we had to get a 4-wheel drive pickup to go up and get the children and the parents who were coming with them, accompanying them for care and protection, and drive down to where the road was manageable, and then they could transfer from the pickup into the minibus and get to the capital city. After making their presentation, the children gave their challenge directly to the government minister for the family about what she was going to do in response, and they gave the same challenge to all the conference delegates at the end of the conference. What are you going to do? What's your commitment to children to reduce violence that we suffer? And the following year, the children retold that experience in words and pictures, and it was published in a handbook of children and young people's participation, if you'd like to follow that up further. So chapter 3, I'm just going to check my watch now to make sure I'm doing okay for time. Yes, I am. Good. Yeah. So by that time, I decided to make my life in Nicaragua and stay there. We started to develop the approach known as transformative research by children and adolescents. Because from around 2010 onwards, we stopped calling the children who were doing these investigations consultants and simply called them researchers, because we realized that they had started investigating and taking action on issues that they identified in their own communities. A consultant really is hired to work for somebody else, the in inverted commas client. So these children then became transformative researchers. So I'm just gonna, there were maybe a dozen of these child-led transformative researcher projects over the years that I was there, but I'm just going to pick on one example to show you. Children from the village of Yukul formed a research team and chose an issue affecting their families and their community that they wanted to find out more about. And the topic they chose to investigate was how alcohol is related to violence in their community. And I repeat, this is a topic they chose to investigate. Nobody suggested this to them. So they planned their research. Once they developed a questionnaire, they interviewed not just other children, but teenagers, parents, community leaders, school teachers. They even went into town. We arranged for them to travel into town to interview the chief of police. Then they analyzed all the data that they had gathered. They prepared their report and their recommendations. And that report was published in this book, first in Spanish, the original Spanish in Nicaragua in March 2012. And then we got some funding to have an English translation done. And again, that is still available. There are actually 4 reports by teams of child researchers in the book on different aspects of living without violence in rural Nicaragua. And 10 years later, finally, myself and my colleagues in SESMA, we published a step-by-step methodological guide setting out how we actually organize this process with the children. So just very quickly, the steps that are, again, we could do a whole lecture just on going through these steps, but the book is available online. So first, identification, selection of the children and young people to form a research team, then establishing the preconditions for convening the team, establishing the role of the accompanying adults, building the research team, choosing a research topic, using children's drawings, interestingly, to encourage team reflection on the topic. That was very much part of our way of working, and that even goes back to the children's consultancy in the United Kingdom in the 1990s. Designing the research, designing and developing research instruments, usually simple questionnaires that children could do peer-to-peer research, preparation for the field research, and particularly preparing the young researchers and issues of protection and safety and so on, doing the field research, managing the data and analyzing it, reaching a consensus on conclusions from the research, formulating recommendations, writing a report, drawing up an action plan, and then finally actions at various levels to disseminate the findings. Finally, evaluation of the process. So all of that is set out in the guide that we just published, and that was the kind of process that the teams of child researchers followed for each one of those examples. So one more chapter, just checking. Oh, I'm doing very well for time. That's good, because I want to have time for questions, and there's already quite a lot of questions. So develop chapter 4 from 2012 onwards, developing partnerships with children. In 2012, I returned to my native land, and I was enticed back to Ireland by the offer of a funded PhD studentship at Queen's University Belfast. In fact, my supervisor was Professor Laura Lundy, who Cynthia, I think, already mentioned, who invented the famous Lundy model for children's participation. And as an aside, my plan was to work very hard, get my PhD, become a doctor of children's rights, and return to Nicaragua. But I brought my Nicaraguan wife and daughter to Belfast with me. I said, we'll go to Belfast for 3 years, we'll have a great time, and then we'll go back. And when I finished my PhD and was ready to go home to Nicaragua, my Nicaraguan wife and daughter absolutely refused to go back. They said, you must be joking, we're staying in Ireland. And so I'm still here 10 years later. And in fact, again, I don't really have time for gossip, but my wife, Maria, is visiting her mum in Nicaragua. And as I speak, she is selling our house in Nicaragua. We finally decided after 10 years away that we'll never be going back to live there again. So we might as well sell the house. So that's happening. That's happening as I speak. So yeah, so we're based back in Ireland now. Anyway, that's, I say, off the topic. But we came back to Belfast, and my PhD topic was to research children's perceptions of their rights at school in Nicaragua. And my methodology was to apply that same transformative research by children and adolescents approach that I've just told you about, that we developed in Nicaragua, to a PhD study. And my challenge was to make this very child-led approach work within the rigorous constraints of a PhD study, which I did, because I am now a doctor. So in 2013, I returned to Nicaragua to mobilize a new team of child researchers. So again, the whole process, starting with building a team, sharing their experience, starting off with drawings, but rather than the drawings being a subject for sort of psychological analysis, the drawings were an incentive for the children to discuss their knowledge and their experiences. We informed the parents. I didn't show you this before, but every time we did one of these projects, the parents were kept informed. They knew what was going on. They knew why their children were doing this, and they were almost invariably supported. In a few cases where at first the parents were doubtful, then we would visit them and talk to them. Not me personally, but my Nicaraguan colleagues would convince the parents why this was a valuable experience for their children to be involved in. And you know, they'd be just as well doing this as working on the farm or working in the home or whatever. Planning the field research, and then peer-to-peer interviewing in the community. And then once they gathered the information, the data analysis, creating the final report, posing for the camera at the final session. And an amazing opportunity came up. It just so happened that there was an international meeting of all the senior leadership of Save the Children for the whole of Latin America in Nicaragua at that time, and they invited the children to present to them. It was a bit of an unusual thing because the kids had just finished their research and they hadn't even presented their findings to their own communities or their own schools. So the very first presentation they got to do was to this huge, prestigious international audience, but they were very much up for it and they really appreciated that opportunity. And we got some lovely feedback from the Save the Children people. So, checking my watch again. Yeah, I'm okay. This experience inspired the development of a new analytical tool to help researchers develop partnerships with children and adolescents. So the last thing I want to do now is share this with you. So we're going to build a matrix. For some reason, my mind seems to work this way, combining two or more dimensions of variability. So for a matrix, you have horizontal and vertical. You're working in sort of 2 dimensions. So for a horizontal axis, we'll have a continuum of power and influence, from children having no power or control over a research process at one side to children running things themselves at the other side. And then for another axis, we'll do a timeline of the research process. So to create that horizontal axis, we're going to use Jerison Lansdowne's simplified typology of participation. Lansdowne suggests that really when you come right down to it, there's only 3 kinds of child participation. One of them is consultation, which is when adults ask children for their views, but children are not involved beyond that. Once children give their views, that's that they've done their thing. But then you have collaboration, which is when adults and children work together, sharing roles and responsibilities in planning and carrying out the activity. And then there's what Lansdowne calls child-led, but I like to call by the Spanish word protagonismo, or proactivism, where activities are initiated, organized, or run by children and young people themselves. And yes, adults may still be there providing support, but that's not always necessary. And for a vertical access, the phases of a research project, there are various published versions of this. I found one by Kumar that seemed to fit the bill, starting from identifying the research question and running all the way down to, well, basically, I think Kumar goes down to 8, dissemination of findings, publication, wider publicity, and so on. But for us, adding this number 9 was important because this is research with a purpose. This is research that aims at social change. So once the findings are published and disseminated, we have advocacy, mobilization, campaigning, seeking policy impact and action for social change based on what has been found in the research. So now we combine those 2 and we have the matrix. So we can write in descriptors in each box. You'll see along the top there, we've added a column where children are not involved, because that is the reality. In much research involving children, they're not involved in many of the stages. And to complete the model, we need to add another column. It's like a 3rd dimension of who is involved, which children are involved. So we're saying that children are involved, but we have to ask, well, which children are involved? Because if we answer that question, we're saying, well, which children have been left out and why have they been left out? So that's another column on who's involved and who's excluded at each stage in the process. So now we have the matrix. Let's see how it's used. So I'm going to apply this tool to do an analysis or an evaluation of some of the projects I've just been describing to you. So actually, this one I didn't describe to you. So this is a project that we did, which was a collaborative project, an adult-led project where we ended up collaborating with children in the analysis and dissemination phase. But this is the UCL children's study on the relationship between alcohol and violence in their community. So in this one, you can see that the children chose the research question, but I and my colleagues worked closely with the children to develop research methods and prepare questionnaires and so on. But once the children had their questionnaires, they went out into their villages. They found the peers, the people they were going to interview. They did the interviews, and then with our support, they analyzed the data and drew their own conclusions. Again, with our support, they produced their report, and we worked together on the dissemination of the report and the action plan afterwards. Now, it just so happens that in 1999 in Australia, a scoping review was carried out to look at the different approaches to participatory research with children in Australia. And this is a summary of their findings. The blue boxes are where children were consulted, the orange ones where it was collaboration, and the gray ones where it was child-led. And they used the different stages of the research process. An interesting thing is the false axis along the top there, where it jumps from 12 to 200. So if this was a diagram drawn with a real axis, it would actually look like that. So what that tells us is the children were, in the vast majority of the 211 papers, the children were only involved in providing data to the researchers. They called it participatory research, but that is just what they were doing. They were asking children for information, collecting that information, and that was that. In the vast majority of the studies reviewed, children were not involved at all outside of the data collection phase. Takes another look at the watch. We're just going to make it. So now we know from that piece of research that the norm for involving children in research, as verified by Grace and colleagues' study of 211 published papers, is this. Children are not involved at all in deciding what the research question is going to be. They're not involved at all in designing the research, preparing the research instruments, or even deciding who's going to be involved. They are involved when the adult researchers consult them to gather data. Then they're not involved in drawing the conclusions, producing a report, dissemination, or any further action. Like I say, this is not my hypothesis. This is the results of the scoping review by Rebecca Grace and her colleagues in Australia. So that is the norm for how adult researchers do what is called participatory research with children in Australia. That matrix tool is now published. It's in that book, but you can also get it at my website if you don't have access to the book. I would say please do use it as a tool when you're planning research projects involving children, and do use it also as a tool for reviewing and evaluating research projects involving children. And you can use it as a checklist to be sure that that you're not excluding children unnecessarily through narrow thinking. But, and here's a crucial point, I don't want it to be seen as in any way judgmental. Don't use it to make judgments about whether any particular approach is right or wrong. It doesn't do that. It just helps you to ask good questions and therefore to be able to make wise decisions about what might work well in a particular situation. And as I said, to make sure you're not excluding children just through narrow thinking. So there you are. That's my story in 4 chapters. I hope there's something in it that's useful. Thanks very much for listening. What I will do is provide to, I guess, to Marianne afterwards a PDF version, because these are all the references here. So if I provide a handout with all the references in, if you want to follow anything up, it's all there. So that's it. Thank you very much. Stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Harry. That was fabulous. With this one, perhaps to Harry, I wonder if you found any challenge to the research from adults, and how did you respond?
Very little, but I think, again, working with SESMA, working with a Nicaraguan community organization that was strongly embedded in the community and understood the community development. So anything that we were proposing, we would talk to the adults who might be affected by it. So we were working in parallel with parents. And like I showed one photo of a meeting with parents whose kids were going to be invited to, be in the research team, and the parents could ask anything, and we would explain everything. Also, school teachers, it was easier for us to even, you could send a letter to the school saying that we're doing a research session on a Wednesday morning, so such and such will miss school that day, and can you give your permission, and things like that. Community leaders. This was in a rural area where there were some village communities with established customary community leaders. So we would be talking to them, and we would usually have their support. A little bit more difficult when you're working on a coffee plantation, which is being run as a business, sometimes by an absentee landlord with a manager in place, and that's a whole another story. But there, yes, in some cases, basically, there were some coffee plantations where they didn't want us interfering. But there were others where they were kind of feudally run, where the people running the coffee plantation would have a sense of, these are my people, and although I'm here to make money by growing coffee, I also need to care about the people. And so we were saying the children are not investigating this to damage your business. They're investigating it to improve life for their community. So yes, there were coffee plantations where we simply didn't work because we weren't made welcome, but there were others where there was an understanding. And the final one, although things are changing quite quickly, Nicaragua was a very sort of masculinist sex. In Spanish, of course, they call it machismo, and there were kind of established roles for boys and girls, and often parents would feel happy enough for the boys to be out and about doing whatever, but they would be wanting the girls to stay at home and help their mum prepare for their role as housewife and mother in the future. So sometimes we were talking to parents about the fact that this should be equal opportunity for girls and boys, and that girls should have the same opportunity to be out and engaging in the community as boys do. And again, we usually, by taking time to hear them, you don't just go into the, again, and not me doing it as I was like the only outsider European person in the whole team. So it wouldn't be me going in to tell the parents that I didn't agree with them. It would be local people talking to local people about why, first of all, understanding their concern and then talking it through with them. So yeah, the biggest obstacle really would be parents with very old-fashioned traditional views.
Thank you. Thank you. That was from Jill, who's on Children's Parliament, and also the first couple of questions were from Shier. Here's a question also about any of the speakers, I think, from Sarah. I wanted to know, do you have experience in co-designing an intervention with children's involvement? To consider an intervention co-designed, should it be designed entirely with children, or can we offer example practices and get children's feedback and modify the intervention accordingly? So I don't know who'd like to answer that one.
I can start. Yes, you can do both. I didn't include it in this talk because it wasn't strictly, it wasn't on topic, but the project I'm currently working on at University College Dublin in Ireland, again, we're using the CRAG model, Children's Research Advisory Group. And again, this comes from Laura Lundy's work, where the idea that rather than children as researchers, which was, if you like, my model from Nicaragua, the adults are professional researchers. And so it's not like getting the children to do the research for us, which is what I did with my PhD. It's the adults are the professional researchers, but we set up an advisory group. So the children and young people become advisors to us. And that way you have this sort of co-design thing going on. We can bring any issue to them. And they will advise us on how, from a children and young people's point of view, how we should do this. And our project has been this is the first time I've ever done this, because it's not the model that I was using in Nicaragua. But it's the first time where I've done a project with a team, working with a team of adult researchers, but advised by a team of young advisors. And that means, yes, you can have co-design. You can take aspects to the children. Either you can give them a blank sheet and say, we need your help in developing this, or you can take something you're planning to the kids and say, tell us, will this work? Or if it won't work, how can we fix it? So you can do all of those things with a CRAG. So this has been a new experience for me. It was very tough at the start because we had to do it online. And I started this 2 years ago, and it's just coming to an end now. again, it's got its own website, www.covision.ie, if you want to know more. But yeah, it's been a learning experience because I wasn't used to working with young people online. And Karen was talking about this earlier on, about there are some benefits from working with young people online, but there's also challenges, especially for somebody like me who could be a bit set in my ways. And I'm used to working where you're all sitting around in a circle and chatting, you know. So this Zoom screen thing is a bit different, but no, we've made it work. And yeah, it's so I would say if you're interested in the idea of co-designing an intervention with children and young people, this idea of setting up an advisory group or a youth panel or whatever it is another. It's not the same as children as researchers, and don't mix them up. It's adult researchers being advised and guided by child advisors.
Thank you, Harry. I think this one's for Harry. David, his question is, how are the meta skills of Western paradigms of research, assuming they're not, if they're not assumed knowledge, taught by the adult team and learned by the children researchers in your work?
Well, that's a deep question, but the first thing to point out is that the culture of Nicaragua is certainly not Eastern. It's a very interesting mix. Of course, Nicaragua still has a strong element of indigenous Central American culture, but it was conquered by the Spanish hundreds of years ago. So it has an imposed European culture laid over the indigenous culture, European Roman Catholic kind of culture. Then the British took over and brought African people to Nicaragua and made them work as slaves. And so there's elements of African culture intermingling with the indigenous culture and the imposed European culture. And then, of course, Nicaragua had a communist revolution in 1980. And so there is still a very strong, in fact, the same party, the Frente Sandinista, is back running the country again. So there's a strong element of modern Marxist-Leninism, revolutionary communism embedded now, built into Nicaraguan culture. So it's a very strange mix, but you're not dealing with any kind of traditional, Eastern culture in Nicaragua. You're dealing with something very unique. So basically, our way of talking about research with children is, my definition of research is it's something that leads to creation of new knowledge, knowing something that was not known before. If we're just repeating knowledge that's already known, we're not doing research. We're just doing kind of journalism or whatever. So research means you're creating something new. You're knowing something that you didn't know before. And all the different methods of research, in the end, what they're doing is trying to come up with some new knowledge that can then be shared. So we're talking to the children about what are the problems in your community? What are the issues facing you in your lives that we could do something about if we knew more about them? If we understood more what's going on here, like say the alcohol thing, the children felt that there was a problem in their community because alcohol seemed to be causing violence and domestic violence and community violence and so on. And so we're saying, if we understood better what's going on here, how people see this, then we'd be able to suggest something. And so you're saying research creates knowledge. If that knowledge is relevant to the issues in your life, then we can use it to push for changes. So that was how we explained it to the kids.
Thank you, Harry. And another one that's a little bit related, we've only got time for probably one or two more quick questions. How do you go about designing ethics when you're usually requiring the research question and design beforehand to get approval? Maybe it's not quite so difficult in some places, but
well, again, I'll quickly start on that and let others have a chance. But this was in SESMA, we weren't working under the auspices of any university, so we weren't tied to an institutional ethical procedure, and that meant we had to do it ourselves. So we designed bottom up a code of child protection and safeguarding code. And this was, again, another participatory process. Rather than just copying one from somewhere, we started discussion groups with children, with teachers, with parents about what were the risks, about what would help to reduce the risks, and then putting that together as a code of practice. So in the work I was showing with SESMA, we developed our ethics in that way. When I came to do my PhD, I found myself for the first time confronting a university ethics procedure. So yes, that was about dialoguing with the ethics committee about what I was planning to do and how I could guarantee that this was in fact ethical and safe. And slightly different from most of the work in Nicaragua, when I got my PhD studentship, the broad research topic had been set, but the children themselves, and I decided that I wanted to do it in this way. So I had to put that into a proposal and get ethical approval for it.
Thank you. Any other comments?
Other people probably have different experiences from mine. My experiences were not pretty typical.
Julia, a question for Harry, if time permits. Have you kept in contact with the children from your earlier work and have any pursued a career in research and advocacy?
Well, yes, and in research, no, but in advocacy of various kinds, yes. And here another reference. When COVID came, it wasn't really possible to continue doing that kind of work in the communities in Nicaragua. So by that time I was back in Ireland, but my colleagues in Nicaragua spoke to the funders and got permission to do a retrospective review, what we call in Spanish sistematización, but it's kind of a retrospective review of the whole previous 10 years of research with and by children. And so we contacted some of the young people, some now young adults who had been the children, and in some of the photos, I mean, I could show you now photos of then and now, you know. So we did actually, we are still in contact with some of those young people, and also now, even in COVID times, the SESMA team were able to travel to the coffee plantation on a motorbike with a mobile phone and get a connection. And so we were able to involve them in Zoom meetings via satellite, which was that just blew my mind. So we did this systematización, a looking back overview of the whole 10 years, and it is going to be published early next year. It's in the new handbook of children and young people's participation. I think I showed you the old one from 10 years ago. The new one is at the printers, I believe. So you'll be able to read that review, and that actually involves some of those now young adults. So none of them I know that as far as I know, are working in universities as researchers. Some have stayed in the communities and are now young adult leaders. They're people regarded as leaders of their own communities. Some have gone into education. A couple have done teacher training and become primary school teachers, who again are important leaders in their own village communities. Others have gone some have gone into politics. You know, we could spend a whole day talking about Nicaraguan politics, but some have taken up positions in the Frente Sandinista, are involved in running the country, and one I know of became an evangelist preacher. So they're exercising their leadership in and other one went into community folk dance and runs a folk dance school. So yeah, they're exercising leadership, following their own paths. But I don't know anybody's actually gone into research as a university researcher.
Thank you so much.
But yes, we are still in touch. It's wonderful. That's one thing about working in small rural communities. It's just a different vibe.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I need to close the session now. It's been an absolute delight to